Thank you for coming. It's a rainy, nasty day out there, but the food will be good afterwards, and the presentations between now and the food will be even better. My name is Tanvi Nagpal. I'm the director of the IDEV program and a practitioner in residence here at SAIS. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the final practicum presentations for 2018-19. The practicum is now 6 years old, and it's definitely institutionalized within IDEV. Student teams work very closely with clients on a real problem or an opportunity, and they put a lot of what they learn in their classes to work. And this is what the New Balance team had to say in an email to us earlier today. Just this morning, we got this lovely email, and it said, "Your hard work has helped New Balance define a clear organizational strategy to address a real human rights challenge. Thank you for your contribution, and good luck with your presentation this evening." Another email that we got a couple of weeks ago from our PanClap client echoed the same sentiments, saying that the team had completely awed them with the amount of work that they had done. And at a meeting at which they presented their tool, people came up to them and said, "Surely this has to be PhD level work." And we said, "Of course not, it's SAIS level work, it's better." So I won't be summarizing the work that these teams have done, but they've gone from living in one room in a village in Uttar Pradesh to field work in the Caribbean over winter break. And so their experiences have covered the gamut. And they will definitely dazzle you in short order. But I have to first thank some people without whom we could not make this practicum happen every year. This year, we are delighted that we have two repeat clients. The first is Athena in Phonomics, which has hosted its fourth practicum team. And we today would like to thank Vijay Bhalaki, who is here, and Deepa, who is not here, for their partnership with IDEV. We are incredibly grateful when we have these partnerships and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single year. The second is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. And Orion is here today. We would like to acknowledge him and Teal and Bonnie Rafferty for their faith in us and for hosting our teams every single year. We really love these relationships, and we hope we can go back to them again. There are also a few key people that our students would like to thank. From Athena, Vijay, Dr. Joshi, the Athena team in New Delhi, and Grameen Development Service. For New Balance, Shari Gittelman, Stone Wang, Feven Lin, and the entire New Balance compliance team. And of course, Caitlin Hamill, our alumna, who was in the first practicum group and made this partnership happen. From GAIN, we have Orion, Bonnie McLafferty, and Teal Gelch for their commitment to the practicum. For PanCap, Derek Springer, and from PAHO, Sandra Jones, amongst many others. The Windrock team in DC, especially Lauren Purnell, who is another practicum alumna. The Hamro Saman Windrock team in Nepal and Open Institute. And the Jeffries team would like to thank Professors Brodigam and Yoonjung Park and Jordan Bushong from CARI, and Aso Vanasinga and Alan Cameron from Jeffries International. And I would like to personally thank all the faculty advisors, Professor Cinnamon Dornsife, Chris Delgado, Gordon Bodnard, Nina Gardner, and thanks to Lisa and Tarantino for introducing us to PanCap. Lisa was on Professor Deborah Brodigam's capstone team at Columbia. So it's definitely something that we keep doing. And Professor Raul Roman, who's helped all our teams with their research methodologies. So thank you to all of these people and to the SAIS administration for their financial support. They've become really staunch supporters of the practicum. They've asked me over and over if I would do it for the whole school, and I've looked at them as if, you can complete the sentence. But in the end, I'd also, of course, nothing happens at IDEV without. There you go. So nothing happens at IDEV without Ada Ho and Nicole, and I want to thank them for all of their support. And I also want to thank a huge support to Laura, who has come to every practicum meeting, put everything together, really herded cats. And I thank you, Laura, for all of your support. So that's it. Without any further ado, we're going to start with the Athena team.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we worked with Athena Infonomics, which is a global consultancy that uses ICT tools and research for innovation in international development. Athena was already researching ways in which they could improve the livelihoods of small and marginal farmers in Uttar Pradesh in India. And for reference, small farmers are those that have less than 2 hectares of land, and marginal farmers are those that have less than 1 hectare of land. And this small land size kind of prohibits them from improving their productivity and their well-being. So one way in which you can improve their livelihoods is through organizing farmers into groups for collective action. And one particular method is farmer-producer organizations, which is what we ultimately did a deep dive into during our field work in India in January. So we worked with one particular farmer-producer organization in the Maharajganj district in India, and looked at the various actors that they work with along the supply chain. And we've spent the remaining months working on recommendations for an external support program for FPOs so that they can better improve the livelihoods of these small and marginal farmers. So a quick recap or overview of the agenda for our today's presentation. First, Jamie will discuss the challenges that small and marginal farmers face and the role that FPOs can play in addressing these challenges. Next, Yadyan will discuss the case study that we did in India for that specific FPO. I will discuss some of the challenges that FPOs need to overcome in order to better assist farmers. And lastly, Maya will discuss some of our recommendations for improving this external support. And I will hand it over to Jamie.
Thank you, Chloe. Okay. To discuss the importance of FPO, I will first talk about the challenges of small and marginal farmers in Uttar Pradesh. So first, the farmers have a very high cost productions. They need high quality inputs like seed and fertilizer, which are expensive to get individually. They also need farm equipment like water pumps, and they usually rent out from the larger farmer at an expensive rate. And to finance these activities, they can take out loans, but they face a lot of high interest rate problem. The other challenge is the limited market over surplus. First of all, their land size is very small. In the village that we visited, the farmers have average of less than half acre of the lands. So after the self-consumption, they have only little surplus left to be sold in the market. So it leads to low income, low saving, and inability to invest in the future production and also improvement of the livelihood. However, the most difficult challenge is the inefficient market. The farmers lack of a lot of information. For example, they don't know what's new and high-value crops to grow in their lands. They also lack of high real-time price information, so they usually sell their product right after harvest at a low price in order to get the cash in hand as soon as possible. And the farmers are already aware of this process, but they still go to I skipped to the other one. So on top of that, they also have a complex supply chain. So it means between farmers and consumer, there are many intermediaries such as brokers, dealers, commissioners who takes parts of the profits that could be potential income of farmers. The farmers know of this process, but they still go to intermediaries because the intermediary provide necessary services like credit and network with the buyers. However, Farmers Producer Organization can help to address these challenges. FPO is a registered organization, and their members and shareholders are farmers, and they work for the benefit of the farmers. So the first benefit is the economies of scale and collective action. FPO can coordinate collective action to buy the farm equipments together and share among the members. They can also buy a bulk of inputs and then sell to the member at a cheaper price. And collective action can also contribute to bargaining power and lower transaction costs. As a group, farmers have a better access to the market, and FPO can build a partnership with large companies for the contract farming opportunity. Lastly, FPO can fill the information gap by providing agricultural trainings and also value addition services to the members. And all these benefits count toward to social empowerment and cohesion. Now I'll pass over to Yadien to talk about our case study.
In order to see whether FPO works well in practice, we did a case study on the FPO named Lara Agro Producer Company Limited, LAPCL, during our field trip to India. We spent around 8 days in Maharashganj district in eastern Uttar Pradesh, speaking with stakeholders across the whole agriculture value chain. This includes farmers, processors, dealers, vendors, and credit providers. We also spent a few days in Delhi interviewing experts in the field of agriculture economics and counter farming. Specifically, we worked with LAPCL during our stay in Maharashganj and observed their operation closely. It was founded in 2003 by a small group of farmers trying to address the challenges of access to input. To do that, they sought administrative and operational support from a local NGO named Grameen Development Service, GDS, who has been working in the region for more than 20 years to improve farmers' livelihood. With that help, they were able to later register as a formal FPO in 2010. It currently has 661 farmers, members. All of them are small and marginal farmers. Each one of them hold one share of the company. And as we can see from the photo, it was one we take with its CEO and its 13 board members in front of a shop currently run by LAPCL. So currently, LAPCL's business focuses on input supply. They purchase quality seeds, fertilizers, and chemicals wholesale and sell it to farmers at a small profit margin at around 2%. They set the margin to be very low in order to benefit the farmers, as well as to make sure the revenue will cover their operational cost. They also produce their own seeds. As we can see from the photo at the bottom are some samples of their products. We can see LAPCL's logo printed on their bag. To deliver this product to farmers who live in the remote area, they use a network of farmers who will be served as village-level distributors. This network is a very important asset of LAPCL, who will be helping them to access demand, disseminate information, and potentially help them aggregate products in the future. As their current input business has been really strong, they are considering moving forward to expand their business by improve their market linkage. They want to move into collective marketing, and which has the potential to help them obtain higher prices for their members and increase their market powers. However, there is a lot of challenges standing in the way, and Chloe will continue to talk more about that.
Thank you, Yadian. So as Yadian mentioned, collective marketing presents a really important opportunity both for LAPCL and FPOs more broadly to improve their productivity. However, there are a number of challenges facing them in terms of actually being able to do collective marketing, which can be broadly summarized into these three categories. So the first is access to credit and working capital. Collective marketing requires aggregation, which requires storage and transportation in order to store the goods after they get it from the farmer and before they take it to the final buyer. And additionally, farmers require or expect on-time payment in full when they give their goods to the FPO, and this requires a significant amount of cash on hand. Unfortunately, FPOs have a hard time accessing formal capital or formal credit due to perceived lack of creditworthiness or lack of collateral, and the loans that they can obtain from informal institutions are generally not large enough to sufficiently fund these initiatives. The second main barrier is an entrenched value chain. So these agricultural supply chains have existed for a long time. The relationships have been established for a long time, and people tend to go back to actors that they trust. So for a small organization like LAPCL to come in and establish new relationships with large agribusinesses and processors is quite challenging. And the third main barrier is human capital and business acumen. The board members of LAPCL were very honest with us. They felt that they were very well trained in agricultural skills, but they did lack training in marketing, finance, and business, and that in order to actually achieve these initiatives, they did need training in those areas. So that will be an area for expansion. And there have been government agencies that have tried to provide support for these areas, but these initiatives have been unable to generate systemic change. And so Maya will discuss some of the recommendations that we have going forward.
So, as you've heard, FPOs have a lot of potential to improve small farmers' incomes, but they also need a lot of help to navigate the challenging environment that Chloe described. And while there are some efforts to support FPOs, like training from NGOs or government-subsidized credit, each of these typically provides only one or two of the many things that FPOs need in order to become sustainable businesses. So Athena asked us to use our research to develop a concept note for a project to better deliver holistic support to FPOs in Uttar Pradesh. And I'll walk you through the project we're envisioning, which is kind of a one-stop shop to bring together different stakeholders to deliver complementary types of assistance to help FPOs succeed. It may look a little complicated, but one of the things our research really made clear is that it's crucial to have support from different sources, because FPOs need companies to integrate them into their supply chains. They need the government and NGOs to help build their capacity and help them mobilize resources. And they also need a better policy environment to have a chance at success. So that's why we think it's crucial to have a broad, multi-stakeholder project with strong coordination from a partner like Athena. So the first component of our project is technical assistance for FPO leaders. As Chloe mentioned, there's a significant need for training in business skills like marketing and accounting that the farmers who manage FPOs would never have learned. And we also heard that there's a need for agricultural extension services to be better aligned to markets so that farmers choose high-value crops and produce them to buyers' standards. So drawing on the experiences of different organizations that have worked across these issue areas, the project would develop a holistic curriculum for FPO leaders to go through as they establish their business, and then provide more customized troubleshooting and advice as they grow over the next 5 years. Our second component is market access. FPOs need help to form relationships with large-scale buyers, and buyers also need assurances that FPOs will be credible partners for them. So this project would work with companies to determine how FPOs can fit into their supply chains and then facilitate relationships, either directly or through online trading platforms that have been quite effective in other parts of India. And once an FPO and company have entered into a relationship, the project would use the technical assistance to help the FPO manage that relationship and also ensure that the products they're producing meet their customer standards. Finally, we heard about a number of policy barriers during our research, and we think that this project could serve as a platform for all of the different stakeholders to prioritize areas for reform. So while we think it's important for it to be up to them, here are a few things we think should be on the agenda. First, Uttar Pradesh is somewhat behind other states in liberalizing restrictions on who can sell in official markets. And that creates a layer of intermediaries with licenses and also prevents farmers from selling where they can get the best prices. We also heard that online trading platforms are quite effective, but the government and the private sector need to do more to increase the number of kiosks where farmers who don't have computers can go to access these platforms, and also explain how they work and their benefits. We also heard that banks don't always adhere to existing policies to ease access to credit for small farmers and FPOs. So clarifying the products and services that they're supposed to provide and stepping up enforcement will be an important role for the government moving forward. Finally, we think mobile money has a lot of potential to overcome the challenge of getting timely payments to farmers. And so there's a lot of great examples from other parts of the world. So this is an area where it'll be important for the government and the private sector to work together to develop an enabling environment. So those are our recommendations, and we're working with Athena to see how a project like this could move forward. It seems like this is something that we feel has a lot of potential, and we're very excited to see what happens.
So I will quickly just recap our presentation. Small and marginal farmers face difficulties in terms of enhancing their livelihoods and their well-being as a result of their small land sizes, and we believe that farmer-producer organizations can present a solution to this. However, the current landscape for farmer-producer organizations is quite challenging, and the external support that has been provided by the government and other agencies has been insufficient to fully make them a productive vehicle for enhanced well-being and farmer livelihood. So we've created some recommendations that we believe would help ease this issue, and we're excited to see where Athena Infonomics takes it along with other stakeholders. We have learned so much throughout this project about farmer-producer organizations, agricultural value chains, and none of this would have been possible without the support and guidance of the people here. So thank you to all of you. Thanks for listening, and please let us know if you have any comments or questions.
Okay. Professor
You can always
Johnson.
count on me for a question. So thank you, very comprehensive and clear presentation, and congratulations. So my question relates to your policy recommendations, the technical assistance, the market access, and the policy environment. And of those three recommendations, which one would you find most difficult to implement and why?
Yeah. You go for it. I already talked about this.
Why don't you get the second
Okay.
Okay. Sure.
Hi. I also superb presentation. I was really interested in what you had to say about issues of market access and bargaining power. And my question there is in two parts. The one is, so a 600 farmer producer organization is still small. And so one question I have is to whether you're thinking also about a collective engagement across farmer producer organizations. And the other is when you move beyond streamlining and reducing transactions costs into bargaining power, who are the players on the other side of that transaction who might suddenly become resistant to these efforts?
Go for it. Do you want to
I can address the first one. So in my opinion, I think it will be the third one, which is the policy environment. Policy is always a bit more difficult to change. I think that an NGO or a private company could come in and offer this technical assistance and training quite easily, and we've seen success in that in other farmer-producer organizations. I think the other part, the market access and linking buyers and the farmer-producer organization together, may be challenging, because when we have seen that in the past, it's been the initiative of the private sector company. So they realize this need to more easily source goods from farmers who are generally kind of dispersed, and it makes it easier for the private company if they can get it from one source. But I think that with some support from the government or encouragement, that can be facilitated. I think that the agricultural system, from everyone we heard in India, is just very complicated, and there are just a lot of different interests. And so I think that, in my opinion, that would be the most difficult to change. But it's also absolutely essential, because right now some of those policies are working against kind of the benefits of a lot of different actors. So.
I can answer to Professor Levy's question. So we saw a lot of FPO across the regions too, but they're all in like different levels at this moment. And especially the LAPCL model that we looked at, they were making profit, but it was just a break even. So like we believe it's better for now to focus on building their self-sustainability first, and then they can cooperate with the other FPO to work for the common goals, and also share their trainings and also benefits together. But like at this moment, I think their deliverables are so different. So it's better for small FPOs to focus on their self-sustainability.
Yeah.
I'd like to add a little to Jamie's part. So we're also considering like unifying several FPOs at the same levels. But one of the difficulties that the transportation, it's very hard to collect all the products and to deliver it to our buyers. And another issue is it's very hard to make sure the products are in a unified quality. So that's the two things we need to do before we try to expand our scales to a larger FPO.
And
Not so much a question, but
I was just going to briefly answer to Professor Levy's point about potential sources of resistance. This is something we have, in fact, heard a lot about because there are numerous layers of intermediaries who this system that we're looking at, as an endpoint would put out of business, and these sort of traders and commission agents and brokers, are very, in many cases, influential and would not be happy to see their business taken over by an FPO. I think if you have strong backing from the large-scale buyers who are currently sourcing from those people, as well as sort of a concerted push from the government who may or may not have relationships with some of those people, then it would be possible to overcome that resistance, but we do anticipate that being a significant challenge. Sorry, Vijay.
not so much a question, but some comments. Since I'm Vijay Bhalaki from Athena Infonomics and one of the co-conspirators involved in this project in a small way. Wow, you guys made it sound like it was such a smooth sail, start to finish. I think the team got really sort of a first-hand, ultra-real exposure to what a formative research consulting project would be like in a context like agriculture in Eastern UP, which is probably one of the toughest terrains one could potentially ever conceive a project of this nature. You guys have done such a terrific job. I think the way you went about it, the way you steered the whole program from inception to where it now is, I think top-notch consulting work. I guess the sort of real test to the project is to try and crunch as much first-hand learning in that 7 to 10 days of on-the-field time you get, right? And then how you go about doing it, how much you leverage that time. I think you guys have done a fabulous job on that front. And I must confess that the project is actually at a stage where we might potentially be talking to 2 state governments to get them pick up the model, the FPO technical assistance model, which we discussed. Telangana is the front runner. We were hoping UP would be, given that the project was originally conceived out of UP, but we'll get to UP very soon.
That's great.
All right?
Thank you.
All the best, guys.
Any other questions, especially of the type Vijay asked?
Yeah, I don't know if we have to.
We'll make it really brief.
Thanks for the presentation. It was great. I was wondering, with the model, do you think it would be more applicable for different food commodities? It seemed like in the conversation there wasn't per se a distinction between maybe dry, stable goods like beans and cereals versus perishable goods, maybe like produce. And when you're talking about a private sector company, could you kind of talk a little bit more about like what that looks like? I mean, are you thinking that it's a big ingredient company? Is it a large trader at like a wholesale market, a mandi? Or are you thinking it's more of like an ingredient supplier? And I was wondering if you could tell them a little bit more about that.
Okay.
That's a great question. I can address it. So in terms of the type of product that we're looking at, that's great. And in our report, we do elaborate more on that. And for the sake of time, had to kind of streamline it. I think the main difference is in terms of like cereals versus vegetables or produce, as you mentioned. The infrastructure associated with it just gets a lot more expensive when it's produce because you have to be able to refrigerate it. It's much larger, so the transportation has to be larger. Aside from that, I think that the models can be relatively similar, but the costs associated with the produce would be significantly higher. In terms of the type of buyer, do you want to? I think we. I think the ideal situation is like a large buyer like ITC or some sort of large company in the initial stages. I think that would be a bit hard in terms of making those connections. And when we were discussing with the FPO that we worked with, they thought that a more natural kind of transition would be to some smaller, more local companies like hotels or restaurants or hospitals that need a regular supply of food, but that aren't quite this large brand name that would have to then establish infrastructure throughout the state in order to kind of take goods from them. So I think that there can be kind of a step process in order to working the way up, and it could be an assortment of different sized and different types of buyers.
I think that's our time. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Wilbur Schell, and my teammates to my side here are Jennifer, Enrique, and Dylan. We represent two wonderful clients, one being the SAIS China Africa Research Initiative, and the other being Jefferies International. And so our research for these clients took us to Angola, where we explored the greater themes of Chinese lending to the African continent. So market onlookers to this whole phenomenon of increasing Chinese activity worldwide have a lot of questions about Chinese lending. A lot of the policymakers are curious in what are the underlying projects supporting this lending, and what do the private sector players are interested in things such as the term sheets or the interest rates. Now, with Chinese lending right now, there's a very opaque nature, which is difficult for these onlookers, but is great for groups of graduate researchers looking to do fieldwork. So that brings us to our research goal, which we developed with our clients, which was to gain understanding of the principles that China would apply in a sovereign debt restructuring with the context of Africa. So now I want to speak a little bit more about the greater context behind our research. Debt trap diplomacy is undoubtedly something that we've all heard about, especially in the past few years. It really gained an increase in usage in January 2017 with a Project Syndicate article aptly titled China's Debt Trap Diplomacy. So put simply, debt trap diplomacy is bilateral lending with a diplomatic nature, where a creditor extends credit to a debtor country with the hope that they are going to extend excessive credit in order to extract concessions from the debtor country. Now, traditionally, a multilateral unofficial organization such as the Paris Club would actually counter this action. The Paris Club was founded in 1956 during an Argentinian debt workout and has to date worked on over 400 sovereign debt restructurings in 90 different sovereigns. Notably, China is just an ad hoc participant, an ad hoc onlooker of the Paris Club, meaning that they don't have to abide by the Paris Club principles, and therefore Chinese lending can fall outside of these sort of multilateral agreements when it comes to debt restructuring. Now, I've done what I can to try and convince you of the relevance behind our research, but the data does a pretty good job of speaking for itself. As you can see here, China has extended an increasing amount of credit to Africa over the past 2 decades through this data provided through the CARI database. And if we look at this map, also created through CARI data, we can actually see one country in particular has received an inordinate amount of lending from China, and that's Angola, which has received about 30% of all Chinese lending to the continent. So that brings us to our updated research goal, which is understanding the principles that China would apply in a sovereign debt restructuring in the context of Angola and its debt in relationship with Angola specifically. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Will. Under the broader context of Chinese lending to Africa, we chose Angola as a case study for a couple of reasons. First of all, as a country with a classic symptom of the Dutch disease, Angola's economy is largely dependent on the oil revenue. 95% of the exports and 40% of the country's GDP relied on the oil sector, which means when the oil price went down 70% during 2014 to 2016, Angola's economy went down subsequently. This leads to a rising debt to GDP ratio from less than 40% to over 70%. You can refer to the right axis. By 2018, half of the Angola's debt was towards external lenders, within which 23 billion of it is to China. When people talking about Chinese lending to Africa, people always regard China as a single monolithic lender. However, our research shows there are dynamics between different financiers in Angola, at least. So we can see from this chart derived from the Cherry database, China Exim Bank dominated the Angola market for the first 10 years into the 2000s. And then China Development Bank came in 2010 with a group of other state-owned commercial banks of Chinese, starting to initiating larger loans in Angola. The debt structures are also slightly different between the policy banks and the commercial banks. The policy banks' loans are usually using oil revenue as a collateral, whereas commercial banks usually don't have that structure. Coming back to Angola, the country just had its first new president in the past 3 decades, João Lourenço. So since JLo taking to the power, JLo is a nickname from the international community to the new president, nothing to do about Jennifer Lopez. So since JLo taking into power, he has been very committed in a series of political and economic reform. Unlike his predecessor, Dos Santos, who has been a long-term comrade of the Chinese, he started to reconnect Angola with a broad range of the countries, such as China, the broader Europe, and also reconnecting Angola with the previous partners, such as Portugal and Brazil. He was able to won an IMF 3.4 billion extended fund facility in the end of 2018. It's interesting to note that under the EFF agreement, Angola is not supposed to engage in any type of oil-backed credit agreement. This will heavily affect on Chinese lending to Angola. As I just mentioned, most of the policy bank agreements are oil-backed. So it's interesting to see what's going on in the future. So I'll briefly talk about our research. Our project began with 3 months literature review and desk research here in DC. We conducted 5 pre-trip interviews. We spent 14 days in Angola, conducted 22 meetings with 30 different stakeholders, including the Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank, a couple of Chinese SOE managers, and representatives from the diplomats, the private sector, as well as the civil society. We were very lucky to get invited on a car trip with 2 Chinese private business people who took us around the city and see different Chinese construction projects, including one of the Chinatown, which is a construction products market close to Luanda, which is on this photo. I will hand over to my colleague Enrique to talk about the key findings.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'll try to go over our main findings in the next 4 minutes, so please bear with me. Our first question was to understand a little bit better how those oil-backed loan works, more specifically the repayment mechanism. So our first conclusion was that the structure of those loans are similar to the BNDES loans, the Brazilian Development Bank. That was confirmed by 3 stakeholders in Luanda. So here I'm gonna go over the details of the repayment structure based on the contracts from BNDES. So the details are different, but the main structure is similar. So here we have Sonangol, which is the state-owned oil company in Angola, and it has to send oil to a refinery, which is not determined in the contracts with BNDES. There's a fixed amount of oil that needs to be sent, and these refineries sells oil in the world market. Angola exports go mostly to China, but that's not specific in the contract, at least the ones that we have access. And this money goes to an escrow account. What is an escrow account? It's an account that's owned by Angola, but the lenders has access and they can verify the amount of money there's inside. So this escrow account, that in the case of Brazil is in New York, in case of China is in China, is used to do all the debt service from the credit lines. So it's used to repay those banks. And according to the contracts with Brazil, they need to keep at least 9 months of debt service. Why that's relevant? Because it affects the bargaining power of those lenders when we compare with the traditional lenders. So in case of a potential default of Angola, they will stop paying all the traditional lenders at the moment, but China and Brazil have access to debt service for at least 9 months. So if you think about how that kind of messy restructuring process will happen, China and Brazil will definitely have access to better bargaining power. So what happened in 2014 when we had that oil price collapse? Here we have a list of all the financial agreements that Angola had at the time, and you can see that they had a lot of access to international finance market. So we have a couple of loans from China, but also they had loans with a lot of European banks at the same time. There's just one loan that stands out from China. That's this 15 billion loan from China Development Bank, and 10 billion of that money went straight to Sonangol. But this is only part of the story. Here on the right, we have the relation with this credit line. The money goes from the Chinese bank directly into for the Chinese SOE company that is doing the infrastructure project. But at the same time, what we're trying to show here is that Angola was hiring other companies to do infrastructure project in Angola. So today, when you go to Luanda, what you see is a lot of construction cranes that are not being used anymore. Why? After the crisis, Angola has stopped paying those private contracts, but they never stopped paying the bilateral loans to China. It was one of the examples, one of the best examples, it was about the Chinatown, Kilamba Kiashi. It was hired not under one of those credit lines with a Chinese bank, but directly was paid by Angola. But they stopped paying in the late 2014. So China had to give another loan specifically to give the money for that company that was complaining they were not being paid. For us, it was interesting because when we went to the debt management unit inside the Ministry of Finance in Angola, the first thing that happened is that they show us a presidential decree saying that they were not allowed to receive any creditor without the presence of a public official from the ministry that was responsible for that contract. Because I think we look like creditors in Angola, I don't know why. There's a lot of Portuguese businessmen and Brazilians. But our conclusion was that there was no default, so it was no evidence at least of restructuring in the time. So how that helps us to understand the China behavior toward debt restructuring? First, this debt trap narrative is a little bit exaggerated in our view. Most of the contracts seems to be commercial based. And also Angola has more agency than usually is recognized by the Western media. I'm now going to pass over to Dylan to go over our findings, our conclusion.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to look at the implications of our research. To wrap it up to our research question, having found no evidence of recent debt restructuring, we're unable to really assess China's behavior in those activities. However, we would say that this overall relationship would benefit greatly from greater transparency and scrutiny. Some policy implications. For market players who are looking at Angola and China currently, Angola, the debt sustainability is there, as is tested by the IMF, EFF, as well as the sort of more recent behavior by the IMF. But the market variables are very, 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 very critical to this piece. If Angola is exposed to any negative movements whatsoever, it could potentially cripple their economy. So market players need to be very careful for this. Within international institutions, they need extra scrutiny. They need to demand to see these contract terms. The IMF has these. We're hoping at some point they're considering releasing these to make the whole relationship a little bit more transparent. We also recommend the IMF consider staying on after their debt service in more of a Ukrainian model. And for the government, economic diversification has to be the most critical piece of their policy going forward. They're looking at agricultural sustainability, as well as some nascent industry within the country itself. And a few items that we don't currently know and we hope that others pursue in their own research. The actual interest rate on the Chinese loans would go greatly into the discussion of debt sustainability across the continent of Africa. Those term sheets are very hard to come by. We're hoping that at some point someone is able to locate a good stack of those. We would like someone to examine the possibility of China rebundling their private contract debt into their bilateral debt, thereby ballooning their bilateral debt, which would again work itself into the debt trap diplomacy narrative, but we don't currently believe that is occurring. We're also interested in China's feelings about moving below the IMF in terms of repayment. They would now be second in a cash waterfall system, and we would be interested to see sort of diplomatically how those relationships play out. But with that, we'd like to open up for questions and answers, and we would like to thank a few people. We've got Deborah Brodigham and Jordan Bashong from CARI Alan Cameron and Asa Van Eysing from Jeffries International, of course, Ada, Nicole, and Laura, Professor Tanvi Nagpal and Professor Gordon Bodner. Without these people, we would not be able to have completed our practicum. It was an incredible experience, and we thank you all very much.
I had a quick question about, you mentioned that you had interviews with in-country stakeholders, including civil society organizations. I'd be interested in, if you can answer, what were some of those civil society organizations and what your key takeaways were for conversations with them?
So our main civil society connection was actually a friend of another SAIS student that was put in touch with us, a gentleman by the name of Trezor, who is a human rights attorney. So the discussions mainly revolved around the internal pressure that the debt caused on Angolan society, namely leading to lack of human capital development, hardly any social safety net of any form. And he was saying that there was a period of time in the 2000s where there was a lot of push for change for that, but under the Dos Santos government, it was unable to be realized. And they're hoping that under the current president, that might happen. But again, the debt pressures on the Angolan government, the fiscal pressures are still very extreme.
I think also what we learned from those conversations was that most of the stakeholders that were not from Angola were super optimistic about Angola's future, especially after the IMF deal. Every time I had a conversation with a taxi driver or a professor at the university there or the civil society members, they were more not sure about the social impacts of the agreement and if they would be able to deliver everything that was promised there. There's discussion about the reduction in subsidies to gas. And while all the foreigners were super excited about the changes, the locals were, I don't know if this is really going to work.
Sir?
That was a great presentation, pretty timely given that the Belt and Road Initiative meeting's going on in China right now. It sounded like most of this debt was just straight bilateral debt, but you mentioned towards the end state-owned enterprise debt. And I'm wondering if you got any sense of whether there was good value for money in the debt. I mean, it's one thing just to lend to the country. It's another if you're lending for a specific purpose. Sometimes what you're lending for may not actually be worth the amount that you're borrowing. And I'm curious if you, which is a huge issue with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm wondering if that came up in your research.
I can.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in some of our conversations, and this is more about the bilateral credit lines, but there was indication that so the recent, Angola recently got, what was the from China?
2.2 billion.
2.8 billion from, in credit from China late last year in Q4. And that was simply all that was reported in the media. And in conversations with a lot of people who are a little more privy to those discussions, it seems as if Angola might have actually requested significantly more and come back with significantly less than they requested. And now there are a few theories as to why that was, being that no one that we spoke to was in the room. But one of the dominating theories that was kind of corroborated between a few different sources is that Angola wasn't producing high quality projects to support the level of credit that they were looking for, and that China actually nixed a lot of them because of that. Does that answer?
And I'll also add that, as one might expect, the blame is across the table, of course. The Angolan government very much indicated that the construction quality from the SOEs was maybe not to the standard they wanted it to be, whereas the Chinese counterparts indicated that it was actually the maintenance side, the people that took over after the projects were underway, that were not doing their job, and therefore that's why the projects didn't turn out well. There were also, though, some very positive, there were no blackouts in the time we were there, and according to one of the locals we spoke to, had not occurred in many, many months, and that's in large part because of a 750 megawatt power plant that has been tied to the Luanda grid that was part of the projects that was funded under one of the Chinese credit lines. So there are some positive projects regardless of the overall narrative.
Just adding to a little detail about the China Development Bank's action in Angola, they used to, according to the ministry we talked to, they used to take whatever projects the Angola government brings to them. But now, since the Angola step is between sustainable and not sustainable, they start to be critical about the projects that hand to them. They have to see the projection of the project to be profitable in the future before they pass it.
So, are you saying that some of this debt is basically project finance? It's not bilateral?
What happens, the structure is that there are those credit lines, and the Angolan government has to request to put one project under that big umbrella. So the money is always tied to a project. So the money actually don't leave China. They goes from the bank to the SOE that is responsible to do that project. And it's used 85% of money to go to the project. Angola has to pay at least 15%, but it's in advance. So the project only starts when Angola pays this 15%. So the money never goes directly to the Angola budget. It's directly tied to a specific project.
To directly answer your question, it does look like it mimics project finance, but it is through the bilateral debt mechanism.
Right, because if it's project finance and the project doesn't work, then you don't get repaid. No, I mean, it's fascinating. Certainly explains your main conclusion on the need for more transparency.
Indeed. Thank you very much. All right. I think that concludes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Savannah Neumann, and these are my colleagues, Allison Decker, Kamal Clayton, and Angela Mazemba. And we worked for this past year for the Pan-Caribbean Partnership Against HIV and AIDS and the Pan-American Health Organization to assess the implications of treatment scale-up for HIV in the Caribbean. So in 2015, the World Health Organization released an updated set of guidelines that move the recommended treatment level previously at CD4 500 to any persons testing positive for HIV. CD4 is a measure of your immune system, and so a higher CD4 level means a higher progression of HIV in an individual. These recommendations implicate that costs will obviously increase for a country as they will now be treating more people, and these costs have led to only 3 countries since 2015 fully implementing the Treat All policy. So in the Caribbean, HIV has a prevalence rate of 1.2%. Prevalence is concentrated in a couple of key population groups, such as female sex workers and men who have sex with men. And finally, importantly for our research, there is forecasted decrease in donor funds. Currently, treatment in the Caribbean nations is highly dependent on outside funding and grants. And so it is under this backdrop that we undertook the research aim of constructing a cost-benefit analysis tool that will be used by HIV and AIDS managers in Caribbean nations, as well as a supporting overall economic analysis that looks at the key cost barriers and assumed benefits of the Treat All policy. We identified 4 countries that we visited in our fieldwork in January. Myself and Allison visited Antigua and Barbuda and St. Lucia, and Kamal and Angela went to Trinidad and Tobago and then Grenada. These 4 countries were identified because they have partially moved to the Treat All policy, however, have not formally implemented the policy. And so we saw our research falling into 4 main parts. First, a literature review, which we undertook in the fall, our field research, which was conducted in January. And then when we came back from our field research, we constructed our cost-benefit analysis tool, as well as put together our economic analysis. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who will talk more in depth about our field research and our key findings.
Thank you, Savannah. So as Savannah mentioned, we wanted to make sure that we conducted our field research in the Caribbean to maximize the kind of short week that we had in each country. So to that extent, we conducted a stakeholder analysis before we left to identify who could help us to determine what we really needed to include in this tool and in this economic analysis. So we primarily first sought to meet with persons within the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Finance, specifically people who dealt in procurement, in budgeting, and as well as kind of a top-down chief medical officer who could explain the HIV/AIDS treatment in each country. We also really wanted to meet with NGOs on the ground who could help us to determine, especially for the vulnerable groups, men who have sex with men and commercial sex workers, what kind of gaps might be in what was happening from that top-down approach and who was really seeking treatment and getting access. And additionally, we also spoke with a lot of community health workers and program managers on the ground in order to determine the day-to-day treatment of HIV/AIDS and what that looked like. We also met with academics who could help us to elaborate on some of the concepts we would need for the tool, so some of the health statistical modeling and financial aspects to inform the tool development. So I'm just going to briefly review 4 weeks in 4 countries, so bear with me. But we did find some key similarities and challenges across all 4 countries that we sought to incorporate into the tool and economic analysis. So primarily, we found that for some countries were already indeed implementing this policy, but just didn't have it on the books. So for us, that meant that maybe perhaps the cost forecasted might not be as much of a scale-up because it was indeed already happening. We also found really high levels of government buy-in and enthusiasm, especially within the Ministry of Health and Finance, which was also critical because it meant that this implementation of this new policy would be feasible and was a goal for many of the countries. We were also happy to see that ART medication was widely available, so it was not a question of access, but rather kind of getting people to the medication. However, we did find key challenges as well that informed some of the variables that we included in the tool. Stigma, adherence, and psychosocial support were ones that interviewees mentioned almost every time that we had an interview. So challenges of stigma affected the development of the tool because, especially for kind of these vulnerable groups, the small nature of the island meant that there might be one hospital, and so when they would go to that hospital, they would see everyone that they know. And since HIV and AIDS continues to have a negative stigma surrounding it, that meant that for implementation of Treat All policy, we couldn't be sure if we were hitting targets of people knowing their status, accessing treatment, and then ultimately being virally suppressed as well. Adherence was critical for us because due to persons taking medication at a very low CD4 count, that means that they might not actually be feeling sick from HIV/AIDS. And so that means for when they take medication, they might think, oh, I don't really need to take this. I don't feel ill. I don't need to do this. However, to meet the Treat All policy, it's critical to take your medication. And so adherence was cited as another challenge for this implementation. And psychosocial support really kind of goes to address both of these challenges. So with additional staffing personnel to kind of follow up with patients as needed, to combat issues of stigma, to make sure that they're taking medication, and to ensure they have the kind of emotional support that they need. That would be another cost associated, as hospitals might have to hire more persons. We also found that data management was a consistent challenge across all of the countries that we visited. For example, in Antigua and Barbuda, they had a database that was stored on an Excel spreadsheet that went back to about like a few decades of patients. And so it was really challenging because we didn't have disaggregated data, such as if the age, if someone had accessed treatment before, and variables which really do affect how you would treat HIV/AIDS. And in almost all of the countries we visited, critically financing was a concern for everyone that we spoke to, which really matters. If they're relying on global funds, they might not be able to implement this policy. And I'm just going to briefly highlight key aspects of each country that really informed the development of our tool as well. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we really crystallized the importance of and the cost for an OECS country versus a non-OECS country. So an OECS is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, and it's these very teeny tiny islands like Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, that although they are smaller, they actually pool all of their costs and access HIV medication through a pooled procurement mechanism. So their costs are actually much lower than a larger island like Trinidad and Tobago, though you would expect that Trinidad and Tobago would have more buying power and could negotiate a little differently. Grenada for us was critical to notice the centralized nature of the response and how that affected stigma. With one hospital on these small islands, again, it's very difficult to convince people to go and access treatment, even though the treatment might be available. Antigua and Barbuda stood out to us for its sustainable financing model. In contrast to all of the other countries that we visited, Antigua was very confident that they would be able to scale up to a treat-all policy. They have a sustainable financial model called the Medical Benefits Scheme, which is financed via a 7% payroll tax and covers non-communicable diseases and HIV/AIDS. So for them, it was really a matter of kind of formally implementing this policy. And this was very much in contrast to St. Lucia, the fourth country that we visited, which had no such policy, and interviewees expressed a lot of concern to us that they would be able to implement treat-all and budget out for it. It's worth noting that they are currently implementing a new World Bank grant to develop some sort of policy, but in the short term, it was not a viable option to finance treat-all. And then again, in terms of financing, St. Lucia interviewees also pointed out to us that a wonderful, incredible benefit is that people will live longer and fuller lives under treat-all. However, when people do grow older, they are more susceptible to chronic health concerns, and so those should also be included in the tool, testing for things like diabetes and hypertension. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Kamal, to discuss the tool that we did develop using these variables.
All right, thank you very much, Alison. So one of the key deliverables was actually developing a dynamic, user-friendly Excel tool that was able to be used by various persons within each Caribbean country to actually forecast on an annual basis the expected annual expenditures for treat-all. So this tool wasn't just simply a costing mechanism, it was also a cost-benefit analysis tool. So beyond just telling the annual cost, it tells you the expectations for how many new persons will be affected or infected by HIV/AIDS. It will also tell you the total number of persons will be treated on an annual basis. So this tool, granted it was so complex and tells so much information, it was also meant to be user-friendly. So just to give you a bit more deeper analysis of how the actual tool works. So there's a tab within the Excel tool that where an administrator within a Caribbean country or within the government that can actually put in to that section key pieces of information as well as key assumptions about the particular country. And based on that information, it's filtered into another tab which actually has formulas, hard-coded formulas that actually do calculations. And based on these calculations, you can actually see an expectation for when the targets for treat-all will be met. It'll also tell you, again, the expected estimated cost on an annual basis for treat-all. And beyond that, it will also tell you the estimation of how many persons will acquire or be infected by HIV/AIDS in the near future. So this goes up until about the year 2030. Now, despite this complex and very useful tool, there are unfortunately a number of limitations. And these are the four key or main limitations that we identified. Now, the first limitation is prevalence of other STIs. What this means basically is that some STIs actually increase the level of transmission of HIV. Unfortunately, we did not take into consideration that within the tool itself, so it's basically strictly focused on HIV/AIDS, and unfortunately, we have no mitigant against that. Furthermore, within the tool, we assume that every person is equally likely to get tested for HIV/AIDS. In reality, that's not the case. Nonetheless, it was very hard for us to actually code that in within the Excel model. The third limitation was that we don't actually have viral counts broken down within the tool. So basically, viral count just tells you how many copies of the HIV virus you have within each person. The higher your count, the more likely you are to actually spread the HIV virus. Unfortunately, that's a downward bias within the tool. So basically, in that regard, we're underestimating the level of transmission. Nonetheless, based on other assumptions within the tool, we do believe there's upward biases that would actually somewhat counteract that downward bias that we're expecting. And finally, we also assumed that we have static sexual behaviors for the next 10 to 15 years. That is, the number of sexual partners for each person with HIV/AIDS is assumed to be unchanging, more or less. So again, based on the literature review across the region, across the world, we realize that certain sexual behaviors are fairly constant-ish. So we don't expect that to be, we don't expect any sudden changes in the next 10 to 15 years, at least within the Caribbean region. And even though it's not mentioned here, again, it goes without saying that the quality of information you actually put in the tool actually does have an impact on the output you get. So granted, these are the four main limitations. It goes without saying that that's also another limitation that we should also bear in mind. And now I'll actually pass it on to my colleague, Angela, who will actually talk about another deliverable, as well as give us, provide the conclusion, as well as some of the recommendations we have in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. So in addition to creating our tool, we were also tasked with developing an economic analysis that sought to look at the cost barriers to scaling up treatment, as well as the assumed and proven benefits of moving to treat-all. And through our research, we were able to ascertain that there is a variation in costs between OECS and non-OECS countries, as Allison pointed out. And this is mostly because of how they procure within the testing and treatment bucket throughout the cascade. And for opportunistic infections and HIV testing equipment and kits, OECS countries, as well as ARV treatment, OECS countries face lower costs because they belong to this pooled procurement mechanism that Allison referred to earlier. Costs will also depend on whether countries choose to implement HIV combination PrEP, specifically for MSM, men who have sex with men, or for all men, which could significantly increase costs. In terms of medical staffing and human resources, while these can constitute a significant portion of the cost, countries in the Caribbean are looking to increasingly decentralize their HIV response and integrate it into their wider health systems. And this would entail overlapping roles for medical staff and lower costs somewhat. Our economic analysis also included a detailed discussion on the assumed benefits of moving to treat all. Two major cited benefits are an increase in deaths averted and a decrease in new infections over time. This graph was generated from our tool by proxying a small generic OECS country, and the orange line shows scenario 2, which is the move to treat all, versus the green line, which shows the current scenario. And despite an initial lag for about a year upon implementation of treat all, you can see that there's an overall decrease in new infections over time up to 2035. So we kind of have a proven benefit of treat all. And we would like to reiterate that our tool and analysis are dependent on the quality of data that's utilized, as Kamal mentioned. So we've highlighted a few potential data development areas to enable more accurate outputs. These include the size and composition of key populations, given the concentrated nature of the epidemic, availability and efficacy of psychosocial services in terms of adherence, behavioral statistics, in terms of transmission-related behavior in the long term. Kamal mentioned that in the short term, this doesn't really change. HIV-specific factors relating to migrant populations, which was particularly highlighted in Trinidad and Tobago. Private healthcare institutions, the level to which people living with HIV and AIDS engage with these institutions, and maintenance for lab equipment and consumables. So I think I speak for all of my teammates when I say that this was a very challenging but fulfilling project to work on, and we couldn't have done it without the help of all of these people, and we'd like to send our very heartfelt thanks, and we now open up to questions.
Thank you once again for your presentation. I was just wondering what your guys' thoughts were on taking the tool to other regions, specifically regions that have higher prevalence of HIV, or whether this tool is better suited for a smaller data set.
All right, so it's a very good question. So more or less, the tool is in Excel. So the more bigger the country is, or the more data you put into it, it's a more difficult it is to actually calculate results. So ideally, it should be for a small population, but with a few slight modifications, it could be upscaled to a larger country, for example, Peru, for argument's sake. Thank you.
You had a graph towards the end which intrigued me. You had infections rising, and then with and without treat all, you had this stark reversal in 2020. And that's nice, but I wonder what the assumptions are that are behind it, whether you feel that the assumption of that stark reversal either way is robust. I mean, lived through from different angles, watching the acceleration of HIV/AIDS across different parts of Africa, and it didn't look like that.
Okay.
When you've got a 1 and 1.5% rate, the challenge doesn't get taken seriously till you get into the 5, 10, 15% rate. And the question behind this is if you think that's wildly over-optimistic, may it be the case that asking a technocratic question on the margin of a treat-all versus a non-treat-all is, in a sense, not looking at perhaps a lack of realism is about what could unfold, but behind that is the question of why that reversal sits there.
All right. So the reversal, again, is based on some key assumptions. So we didn't actually necessarily pick. We based it on the number of countries we actually had information for. And we made a key assumptions that across time, based on aggressive interventions and actually getting persons to take their medication and so forth in both scenarios. So in both scenarios, there's actually a growth assumption that persons will be increasingly adhering to their drugs. They'll be more likely to actually visit their psychiatrists as well as their doctors. So that's one of the reasons why even in the non-treat-all scenario, there's still a decrease, because we actually have fairly aggressive assumptions in place about what can happen if the right things are in place. So that's one of the reasons why in both cases, despite treat-all only being in one scenario, that there's a consistent decrease over time. So we do actually agree with it that we are being a bit optimistic, but at the same time, we're just trying to explain to our client, based on our research, what can happen if the right things are in place, and if they're actually a concerted, dedicated effort to accomplish these targets.
I would like to add, if I can, that we did validate the graphs that we created in our Excel tool through a software called Spectrum that also is used by health economists in the HIV and AIDS response. And our graphs across that we created looked like the same graphs that we were getting out of this very robust software. And so we feel that using the same data points, we are getting the same estimations as this software.
I just want to clarify also that the reason why they were asked to do this is something that we need to clarify as to why, because I think that would put it into, maybe answer Professor Levy's question. So can you tell them how you presented this and why you were asked to do this?
We were essentially asked to do this to facilitate the movement of certain countries in the Caribbean from the current scenario, which is an informal implementation of treat-all, to a formal implementation of treat-all, and that would entail expanded coverage of treatment, and it's envisioned that expanded coverage will enhance patient compliance in terms of taking their medications and adherence, and will contribute to viral suppression, which should decrease infections over time. Would anybody like to add to that?
Oh, okay.
Right, yeah.
No, I would just add that also our client is very interested in working with governments to enable them to, in fact, facilitate this and cost out this optimistic scenario in order to kind of also incentivize the move towards treat-all, as well as the global fund financing is decreasing. So the purpose overall of the research is to enable governments to be able to cost out and kind of incentivize these benefits that will have these great scenarios.
Very short follow-up question. Are any of you concerned from what you saw that there's a risk of an uncontrollable for a while pandemic expansion rather than that? Or from what you learned, are you fairly confident that that's the range?
I would say that we're fairly confident that, barring an external shock, which of course could happen, governments are very committed to doing this work and to implementing these policies. So all of the community health workers were very active in spreading these, and so I would say that it's a very proactive government response to the HIV crisis.
I just want to add just a few things. So remember that these Caribbean nations are very small, and then you can't necessarily compare them to sub-Saharan Africa. Like we have relatively small populations, so it's easy to get outreach and easier to reach these small communities. Because as a matter of fact, most of these islands don't pass 100,000, or let's say about 300,000 in population. So it's not like South Africa, for example, or any other country with millions of people. It's fairly small, relatively middle income in terms of its HGI index. So it's easier for them to actually accomplish this. One exception, however, is Haiti, which of course we actually found out is actually a special case on its own, Haiti and Dominican Republic. Very large population. Haiti in particular is actually seeing a stark increase. So this research was mostly focused on the smaller islands, not on countries like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which are more comparable to sub-Saharan Africa.
Just for everybody, can you tell them how you've already presented this research?
Oh, sorry. So we actually were in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, where we actually presented this research as well as this tool to various stakeholders across the region who would be very much interested in actually utilizing it to actually do their own costing and of course, apply for funding with it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, where's the pointer?
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today. The four of us are the SAIS Winrock team, and we traveled to Nepal this winter to investigate ethical recruitment practices in the country and try and identify possible technology solutions to challenges therein. To start off, we'd like to share a little background as to how our project evolved. So in 2016, Winrock International partnered with Open Institute in Cambodia to develop an online jobs matching platform called Bong Pek that targeted specifically low-skilled and unskilled workers. At the time that we joined the team, Bong Pek was in the process of successfully transitioning from an NGO-funded model to a social enterprise. And Winrock really wanted us to understand what had worked for this model and whether it could be replicated to their other regional work, namely in Nepal. However, given Nepal's context of extremely high emigration rates, for instance, in 2017, 400,000 labor permits were issued for workers looking to migrate abroad, we had to keep in mind that low-skilled and unskilled workers are especially vulnerable to trafficking, and so any employment solutions that we recommended would have to incorporate ethical recruitment practices within them. Keeping this in mind, we conducted our desk research over the past semester and the current, and our field research, we spent 2 weeks in Kathmandu where we conducted focus group discussions and interviews with 16 stakeholder groups, including employers, job seekers, recruitment agencies, and international organizations like the ILO who are working in this sector. For the remainder of our presentation, Johan and Olivia will talk about our findings regarding recruitment practices within Nepal in the domestic context, and Michelle and I will talk about ethical recruitment in the cross-border labor migration context. I'm going to hand it over to Johan now.
Great, thanks, Develina. So our first goal was to understand and capture this development, the Bong Pek development process. So from inception to research all the way up to the present day. And we did this through interviews with Open Institute, as well as analyzing documents provided by Open Institute and Winrock. So from Open Institute's research, they discovered that there's a huge communication gap between this subset of workers, low and unskilled workers, and employers. And so to tackle this communication challenge, Bong Pek developed an array of tools to bridge this gap. One was a web portal where low and unskilled workers could apply directly. A second was a heavy Facebook marketing campaign that used multimedia advertisements to reach a broad population of workers. There was also a very big friend referral system. So when a prospective worker or past Bong Pek user saw these ads, they could refer a friend or a relative to Bong Pek, and they would actually get automated phone calls that would refer them to the web portal to apply themselves. And so this is the initial system that Bong Pek developed to bridge this gap. And I will turn over to Olivia, who will talk a little bit about how this system further evolved as it went live.
Thanks, Johan. So over 3 years of operation, the BOMPEC has been constantly adjusting itself to address the challenges that were not identified by their initial market research. So first, they added a CV creator into the job portal to assist the low and unskilled workers in making standardized CVs that were required by the employers. Then they further strengthened the capacity in marketing and business development in order to form a long-term relationship with job seekers and employers. In addition to that, reaching out to a broader user base is something that really helped BOMPEC to sustain as a business so that it can continue to deliver the services to the population exposed to the risks of human trafficking. And during this process, in order to make sure that the impacts are well captured, they are currently building a dashboard to better collect feedback and also track the impacts. So with the lessons learned from Cambodia, we spent 2 weeks in Nepal and trying to understand whether it's possible to replicate this model in the Nepali context. So I will hand it back to Johan to share our findings.
Great, thanks, Olivia. Like Olivia said, our second goal was to see how this model could be replicated in Nepal. So Winrock had already identified a potential partner who was called Rozgari. Rozgari just means employment in Nepali. And so our two main aims were to document their current model, but also see how it can be adapted to take on some of these BOMPEC tools, as well as any other way to create impactful programming. So Rozgari was identified as a potential partner because it's very well placed. It's the sister company of Meru Jobs, which is Nepal's largest online site for white-collar workers. It also caters to the same population as BOMPEC with low and unskilled workers and provides free services, but has a bit of a different model since it mostly focuses around brick-and-mortar shops called postals. So these workers can actually go to these brick-and-mortar shops to gain free employment matching services. So we also want, and again, our second aim was to see how it could be adapted to the Nepali context. So how can a model with BOMPEC features really tackle the low literacy and language diversity challenges that are unique to Nepal? How can it tackle the prevalence of personal networks for job searches? How can it tackle the preferences for migration as well as greater wages abroad? And how can it also solve some of these other gender and inclusionary challenges that are present in the Nepali job market? So Olivia will go over some of the strengths and weaknesses of that model and some of our recommendations.
So currently, this job portal is only available in English, and it only serves as a basic function of job announcement, which certainly limits its capacity to reach the low and unskilled workers with low literacy levels. In addition to that, some candidates have reported cases where they had to wait for a long period of time to get placed, and even after they get placed, their employer does not always comply with what was said in the job announcement, and that really increased the risk of losing the existing users. However, one thing that really helped Rozgari to stand out among its competitors was the physical job centers, which is the PASOs, that really facilitated the human-centered interaction with the users who tend not to trust technologies. And with the increasing inflow of returning migrant workers and the high level of social media penetration, we do believe that there are several areas for Rozgari to grow and expand. So first, they can upgrade their online portal in a more user-friendly and interactive manner so that the job seekers can access the employment information more effectively with the use of audio messages or animations. In addition to that, the Rozgari can also incorporate the BOMPEC business by adding a CV creator or a learning platform that really caters to the demand of advanced career services. But as we know that informal channels of information is still prevalent and the human touch component of this model really matters, we do suggest Rozgari to adopt a hybrid model that combines the physical locations and also an upgraded service. So having said that, we also, over the 2 weeks, we also were looking at how employee issues play out in a cross-border context. So I will hand over to Michelle to share our findings.
Thank you, Olivia. So as Olivia said, we also looked at cross-border migration, and ethical recruitment is really important in cross-border migration because of instances of trafficking and forced labor, among other dangers. So Nepal is primarily a sending country, which means that most Nepali labor migrants are leaving Nepal to go work abroad. For our purposes, we focused on unskilled and low-skilled workers, and most of these workers from Nepal are going to Malaysia and the Gulf countries, specifically the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. We found that ethical recruitment is not yet widely practiced in Nepal, and also that definitions of ethical recruitment practices vary quite widely depending on with whom you're speaking. But regardless, kind of from the least stringent to the most stringent, these have not been adopted within Nepal, and they're a little bit behind some other major ascending countries. So we identified some key challenges that any solution will have to take into account in terms of implementing ethical recruitment practices in Nepal with regards to technology in particular. First is the norms and expectations that exist. The systems are very deeply entrenched in Nepali culture in terms of how labor migrants find and pursue opportunities, and they really center on word of mouth and personal networks, so trust is a really central component of how things operate right now. We also found that the pre-departure orientations and skills trainings are generally regarded as ineffective, basically by all stakeholders, and they're not really serving the needs of employers or employees. So this is a pretty significant weakness. We found that returning migrant workers are a really big opportunity, and that there's a labor market disconnect that exists right now with migrant workers who are returning with skills they've developed abroad and Nepali employers looking for skilled employees. And so these populations aren't really connecting effectively right now. And additionally, returning migrant workers have their own set of unique challenges, which aren't really being addressed by the government and organizations yet. We also found a lack of external demand in terms of organizations working in these host countries to implement or monitor ethical recruitment practices. So there's not yet collective demand to implement and make sure these practices are happening. We also found, similar to our in-country research, that technology usage and access varies quite widely depending on the population and area. And so vulnerable and marginalized communities in particular have lower levels of technology use and access, and this is really important to consider. And lastly, language levels and literacy levels vary quite widely across the country as well, and there's also a wide range of languages spoken in Nepal, and this is really important in the context of low and unskilled workers in particular. And now Debelina will talk a bit about our recommendations.
Thanks, Michelle. Based on our review of current best practices and our interviews with our stakeholders, we identified a few key recommendations for the Hamro Samman team, that is the Winrock International team in Nepal, to address some of the challenges that Michelle just raised. The first would be to invest in more effective outreach mechanisms. One of our stakeholders, who is a recruitment agency, does this currently by having field offices beyond the capital city of Kathmandu that allows them to actually reach out to populations that are more remotely located. And they also have full-time staff members at these field offices, and that ensures that the risks of fraud and coercion in the process of recruitment are reduced as full-time staff members are more accountable to the recruitment agencies. Next, as Michelle spoke, the pre-departure orientation training programs right now are very broad, and we would recommend the Hamro Samman team to partner with these training providers to ensure that these programs are specific to destination countries where the migrants are headed to, and that it should include comprehensive information like information on norms and regulations, climate, and so on, to really best enable the workers to acclimate to the new countries that they're headed towards. Next, returnee migrant workers are, as Michelle said, not really connecting with the employers who are seeking their increased levels of skills. And so Hamro Saman can really play an important role in connecting these populations to the employers who are looking for high-skilled workers. In addition, they face challenges in being able to reintegrate back into life in Nepal. And so addressing some of those is something that Hamro Saman can also play an important role in. Making technology accessible is very important. Given the vast diversity of languages spoken and the low levels of literacy, it is incumbent that any technology platform that is recommended incorporates a lot of audiovisual elements to make sure that literacy doesn't become a major barrier in access. Next, we also believe that Hamro Saman could potentially partner with employers and private sector players to really present a business case for ethical recruitment, which would go a long way in creating some of that external demand to make ethical recruitment a bit more sustainable. And finally, there are certain policies that we've noticed that work better in implementing ethical recruitment, such as bilateral agreements between the government of Nepal and other destination countries. Hamro Saman could potentially partner with ILO and other organizations to ensure that these policies are implemented on the ground in an effective manner. I'm going to turn it back to Michelle for our conclusions.
Thanks, Debelina. So we just wanted to pull out some common themes that we found that apply to low and unskilled workers, both within the Nepali labor market and in the context of cross-border labor migration. So adapting to both literacy and local languages is really crucial when working with these populations. The use and support of returning migrant workers presents a really important opportunity in both contexts. And lastly, as one of our stakeholders said, Nepal does not yet have a technology culture, but it's seen as something that is just going to continue to increase. So keeping that in mind and meeting the culture where it is right now is also quite crucial to any solution. So we just wanted to thank our partners throughout the past year, Winrock DC, Hamro Saman, Open Institute, and the IDEV program here at SAIS, as well as our stakeholders whose logos are pictured here. And thank you all for coming today. We look forward to your questions.
Can you talk more about the potential hybrid model you mentioned?
Sure. So currently, the Rojgari operates with a similar, sort of hybrid model, but its online platform only serves as a job announcement function. So it's more like an advertisement and not fully operational. So we suggest that the model that we suggest is to have a more upgraded hybrid model with an upgraded online platform that can incorporate some of the experience from BOMPEC.
I also want to ask about ethical recruitment because that's our area. In terms of fees and charges, is there any payments that needs to be done in order to utilize this service?
Our recommendation is to follow the main sort of principle of ethical recruitment, which internationally is an employer pays model, where basically any fees that are incurred in the process of recruitment aren't borne by the job seekers, but by the employers themselves. And that is a fairly key principle in all international definitions of ethical recruitment, whether it's the IRIS standards or by ILO themselves. And so our recommendation to Rojgari, and this is what they currently do as well, is to make sure that the model that they follow is one of employer pays and not one where job seekers would need to pay. Don't know if you want to add anything.
While BOMPEC is more of a domestic-focused program, obviously there is labor immigration out of Cambodia as well. Do you see any overlap between the landing countries, the countries where the workers are headed, that would allow that as that relationship improves, it might have some bleed over to the Nepalese scenario? So overlap with Nepal's immigrant workers or not?
Sorry, your question.
Is there overlap in the countries in which most of labor immigrants are heading?
So whether that model can work in the cross-border context.
So as BOMPEC becomes more successful in Cambodia, it will also push for better recognition of these workers and their role in their bidding for external work. And that would then bleed over into the Nepali context in theory if there's overlap.
Yeah, of course. So one thing that really stands out in the BOMPEC model was the informal social networks that helped the job seekers to build the trust in the platform. And that applies into both a domestic context and cross-border context. And with that, we think that should be something could be integrated into other countries' models as well.
And also just sort of clarify that BONGPEC is exclusively dedicated to within border recruitment processes. They don't actually serve cross-border placement. Yeah. Lauren.
Hello, thanks so much, the SICE team. I'm Lauren Pennell. I'm representative from Winrock. I just wanted to ask for the private sector partnerships you're recommending. What sectors would you say we would have the best potential of connecting with, and why?
So most of the labor migrants we were focusing on are going to work as general laborers or in the domestic care sector or as construction workers. So we think that, well, it's probably a bit more difficult to work with those industries. They're a little bit more informal, that focusing there would be really important to change the norms and behavior at that level.
And is that then you'd recommend we're looking for partners abroad then, or within country?
Yeah, we would recommend looking to work with partners abroad in terms of them requiring and implementing ethical recruitment practices. And so the business case that Debelina mentioned would be to kind of emphasize the importance, but also the financial benefit to them of implementing ethical recruitment practices.
Yeah, just to add something, so Rojgari focuses on a few sectors. So construction is one of them, manufacturing and services. So keeping that focus, I think, would be essential in solidifying those partnerships and making sure that they're impactful.
Oh, yeah. I was the faculty advisor. I've been advising practicum teams for 6 years. I just want to commend all of you because the scope of work was very large, and I was just really pleased with how great a job you did in responding to the client's needs. And just to say thank you. I was very pleased with the outcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, good.
Our presentation.
Oh, do we just click it?
Oh, okay. All right, great. Where do I click?
Wow, okay.
This? Okay. Hello, everyone. We are the GAIN team, which is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, an organization that was launched at the UN in 2002 in order to fight against malnutrition. We are happy to be able to present in front of you all today our findings for our research on supply chains for nutritious foods and improving access to nutritious foods through technology. My name is Melody Tsalmanghu, and I will be starting off our presentation by providing a brief introduction of our research focus, the fieldwork that we conducted, and the methodology that we used to conduct our research. We conducted 2 weeks of fieldwork in Bangalore, India in January, and our research focus was to identify technological innovations that can be used to improve access and affordability to healthy, safe, and nutritious foods in order to reduce malnutrition.
In order to achieve our focus, we set 3 goals for ourselves, which was to 1, assess impact and business feasibility of individual companies by conducting research and interviews, and 2, evaluate the greatest challenges that each individual company faces in order to operationalize their goals and achieve scale, and to provide recommendations to gain on how they can address these challenges, and 3, assess how we can replicate the models in different contexts, such as sub-Saharan Africa. So I will provide an explanation of our methodology in 2 ways, a more macro way and a more micro way. Our macro methodology consisted of conducting a landscape review prior to our field work, in which we identified different stakeholders, such as impact investors, academia, and NGOs, and what they were doing to promote technology. And then we conducted different interviews with impact investors to kind of assess how they assess impact and the methodology that they use in order to come up with our own methodology, which consisted of mapping macro challenges in the food system with solutions, assessing capacity to achieve impact, and assessing business scalability. A more micro version of our methodology consisted of assessing companies by interviews, and prior to our interviews, we came up with an interview guide of 10 plus questions, which were open-ended and which varied depending on the type of business that we were speaking to. And we identified their challenges in order to analyze them and come up with recommendations for gain. The different stakeholders that we interviewed consisted of impact investors, food processing companies, data analytic companies, equipment providers, aggregators and distributors, and other stakeholders such as the World Food Program and a CFTRI, which was a research institute in Mysore, India. And now I will hand off to my colleague Don, who will talk about the macro challenges.
Thank you, Melody. So as Melody mentioned, our first step in our impact assessment framework consisted of identifying the key challenges in the food supply system and then mapping those challenges with solutions. And based on our findings, we concluded that solutions don't consist necessarily of individual technologies, but rather of business models that effectively use these technologies to address these challenges. And we developed these challenges primarily through interviews with impact investors, but also with interviews with other stakeholders that Melody mentioned. And then, of course, we supplemented that with our own assessments. And based on our findings, we concluded, similar to the Athena group, that the key challenge underlying the food system is fragmentation. Fragmentation is a multifaceted issue. There's fragmentation at the farm gate, with smallholder farmers holding less than 2 acres land. There's fragmentation across states, with different states having different languages and regulatory landscapes. And finally, there's fragmentation across the supply chain, with different players not coordinating their activities effectively. A second key challenge is information. There's just a lack of good quality data across the supply chain, and there's poor communication across the supply chain. Food waste is another key issue, with 30% of food wasted before it reaches the consumer. Value add, it's kind of a catch-all phrase, but we're really referring to the relatively minimal use of food processing in the Indian food system. And finally, modernization, we're primarily referring to the lack of equipment and different technologies used at the farm gate. And so, as you can see, our solutions, they don't necessarily map one-to-one with our challenges. Several of these business models seek to address different challenges. The aggregator business model consists of supply chain companies that aggregate supply and demand. They connect supply and demand, and they also provide access to markets to farmers. Distributors have similar business models to aggregators, but they primarily work on transporting and logistics and getting the end produce and food products to consumers. Data analytics companies seek to address the information challenge by collecting and analyzing data and making recommendations based on that analysis. So there's a wide range of different services in this bucket, anything from soil testing to weather advisory and looking at market and then price data. And finally, food processors consist not only of companies that seek to create new food products that might increase shelf life and food quality, but also agro-processing companies that will do things like washing and packaging. And finally, equipment providers consists of everything from companies that develop irrigation equipment to tractors. So the second step in our methodology consisted of developing a key list of questions that seek to assess companies' capacity to achieve impact as well as business feasibility. So the macro challenges that I discussed previously helped us to identify the key business models. This is really to assess individual companies that use those business models. And for assessing impact, we looked at 6 key metrics. Nutritional impact, which aligns with GAIN's primary goals. We looked for a strong management team. Traction, which really looked at how can GAIN be positioned to help these companies achieve their goals and to scale. We looked at quality, and clients really refers to, are they focused on the bottom of the pyramid clients, which again align with GAIN's goals. And finally, adaptability, which relates to one of the goals that Melody mentioned, which was to look at how replicable these models are in different contexts, namely sub-Saharan Africa. Second, we looked at business feasibility, which is an important issue, but we frankly had difficulty getting this information in our fieldwork, primarily because companies were hesitant to share confidential financial information with consultants. But we think this is an important issue, and somebody in the position that's providing capital or providing grants, companies would be much more willing to share this information. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these, but we were really looking at market and profitability, those sort of things. And so now I'll turn it over to Milena to discuss micro challenges and recommendations.
Thanks, Don. So Don had mentioned the macro challenges in the food systems and the food supply chain. So I'm going to go over the micro challenges at the company level and some recommendations. So we thought it was really important for GAIN to look at this as well. So about 45% of the companies, going back to our research and look at the interviews, they had said that the biggest challenge for them to achieve goal and scalability was actually the education of farmers, which we were actually very surprised about. We thought that financial capital was going to be the biggest issue in a lot of startup companies. It wasn't. The second big issue was human capital at a firm level, basically having skilled labor working in these startup companies. That was about 40% of companies had said that. And about 35% of companies said that financial capital was an issue, and about 30% of companies said that other issues, being like branding and marketing and transportation, were big challenges for them to achieve goals and scalability. So I'm going to go over a few quotes that highlights the 2 biggest challenges, which are education of farmers and the human capital. So one of them from one of the companies we interviewed at Spada Advisors said that the greatest challenge in food supply chains is human capital because most of the skilled labor does go to the e-commerce industries. There's just more money into that, so it makes sense for them. And for Cremonchi, that highlights the farmer education is that farmers don't really understand the supply and demand, so they don't know what crops to, what seeds to use in which seasons and so on, and what crops to actually grow. So by mapping out those challenges, we also have a few recommendations for GAIN that they can take into consideration. So for the education for farmers and user adoption, we recommend GAIN to basically go in and train these farmers, building the awareness, helping them with technical assistance, and so on. For the human capital level, we think that GAIN should try and help source talent for them, specifically key managerial positions, since GAIN has a really broad network for that. And for the financial capital, this is pretty straightforward, basically providing grants or providing capital that will support the investors and help start up the companies. So now I'm going to move it on to Dixon, who's going to give out a little case study for us.
Well, thank you, Milena. One of the interesting companies that we engaged with was Cropping. Cropping is a data analytics company that was established in 2010. With employees about 200 people, they have operations in about 30 countries. And then they provide complete farming management services in the form of digital and data management services. In terms of services, they provide farmer extension services, crop health, managing pests, and then weather advisory services and forecasting. They also provide the interesting tool called the traceability, which is very interesting for GAIN because it helps in ensuring the provision of safe and quality foods. These services help in increasing productivity of farmers, It reduces food losses and improve food quality. By increasing productivity, we mean that they help in advising farmers in which crops to grow, and then forecasting the demand of the market and providing information on quality specification and teaching them how to meet those specifications. They help reduce losses by bridging the gap between the farmer and the consumer, making sure that the nutritious food reach the consumer in real time. In terms of challenges, most of the things they said aligned with what Melina said earlier. It said consumer awareness about food safety and quality. They also spoke about the lack of understanding and awareness about appreciation of good agronomic practices by farmers. As Melina and Don and Melody mentioned, one of our research focus was to see which of the models can be replicated in Africa, because most of the challenges in these two countries, or in India and Africa, are similar. And out of the 30 countries that we engage, only cropping is currently operating on the continent. And what has made it so successful is because of the nature of the business model, which focus on creating value. So in each market, they look at the challenges and then they tailor their solutions or services to the market need. They've been successful because they don't deal directly with the farmers, but then they engage multilateral and bilateral organizations. And they also mentioned that in countries where they've had strong government involvement and commitment to the agriculture sector, they've been successful. And they are currently operating in Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ethiopia. The other companies that are not on the continent listed some key challenges as being lack of understanding of the local market dynamics, weak partnerships, and weak agtech ecosystem. They also spoke about risk in terms of political, social, and then uptake by farmers, technological uptake by farmers. As Melina mentioned, human capital is a challenge, not only in India, but they also said in Africa as well. And then a few said access to funding and capital. The key takeaway here is that the partnership with organizations such as GAIN will be very key if these companies will be able to access the African market. In conclusion, we would like to say a big thank you to Professor Napa and Professor Fanzo, who are advisors here, Orion, our GAIN advisor, and Ada and Laura, who has been very supportive throughout this thing. We'd like to say thank you for coming, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you guys once again for your presentation. I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on the landscape review and how you incorporated that into your analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So for our landscape review, we were looking at how different stakeholders were promoting technologies. So we looked at impact investors, academia, NGOs, and we also looked at the human-centered design framework in order to develop our own methodology. We concluded that the impact investing framework made the most sense. It was most aligned with what GAIN was trying to do, which is how to identify the companies that can achieve the most impact and how to help them scale and achieve their goals. So what we looked at to assess their frameworks was to look at different impact investing companies and development finance institutions, looking at their impact reporting to see how they were assessing impact. And what we were surprised with was our findings from this landscape review were pretty different from what we saw on the ground when we were interviewing actual investment officers in India that were making these investments. So the impact investors, what we saw in our landscape reviews, were they were really focused on SDG investing. So looking at things like SDG 2, hunger, and developing metrics and measuring them. But when we were looking at when we were interviewing impact investors, they weren't really focused on that. When they were looking to make investments, there's challenges with getting that kind of information up front. So that was a surprise for us, but it was also kind of insightful. And ultimately, when we were developing our own methodology, we relied more on the interviews with impact investors and our own assessments to develop our methodology.
Hi
guys. Thank you for your presentation. This is quite interesting for us because our team worked in a kind of related area. And I'm curious what your perspective is, given your recommendations about improving human capital, both among the firms and the farmers, what role you see for technology versus more analog solutions, and how that affected your research.
I can answer this one. So a lot of the companies that we actually did interview were tech companies. And one of the biggest challenges that they had was a lot of farmers didn't know how to use their equipment. So that's why we said that maybe GAIN could go out and help out to like for the farmers to use this equipment. I don't know if that really answers your question.
Yeah, I mean,
kind of.
uptake of technology was something we encountered in the
Right.
as well, particularly among small farmers. And I'm curious how important you think it is for them to take up some of these technologies and how you overcome that issue.
I think it's one of the most important things, actually. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Yeah, it's an issue that kept coming up over and over again, right? Because we're dealing with farmers that really don't have, strong educational backgrounds, that might not even own like a smartphone, and we're talking to companies that are developing APIs and pretty sophisticated technologies, and trying to get farmers to sign up to their platforms was a really key challenge. Even if there's a really clear value proposition, it was really hard to get these farmers to understand that and to adopt that. So that's, I think, one of our greatest, one of the best things that GAIN could do to really make an impact in this field.
So you say that, but you also, I thought, said in the presentation that it was the business models and the overall service delivery rather than just the technologies. And so you could elaborate a little bit more on that. I'm also curious, impact investing requires that there's enough of a return, a financial return, that they want to get involved and hopefully have a social impact. It looked, sometimes there are businesses, and ag certainly can be one of those, where the margins just aren't large enough to support private sector or large-scale private sector investing, and sometimes even small-scale. So and I noticed some of your recommendations were around more traditional agricultural extension services and things that probably don't make a profit. So I'm wondering, how much of this do you think really lends itself to more of a market-based solution, and how much of it may be going back to more traditional consulting and other services that will help the farmers but would not necessarily have enough of a return to allow a company to want to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that was certainly a challenge for our research because there aren't a whole lot of investors investing in agriculture. They tend to, and food and nutrition, and they tend to stay away from this field because of the points you just mentioned with challenges with profitability. But another point to make is that a lot of the companies that we interviewed currently have investments from impact investors, which kind of speaks to the potential to create impact and also a financial return. With that said, I think, like I said, we didn't really have much access to financial information, but a lot of the companies that we did ask weren't currently yet profitable. They're all very optimistic and hopeful that they could achieve profit margins, within a year or two, but most of the companies we met did not have have not yet reached profitability. Going back to your first question, yeah, we were looking at business models that use technologies effectively, but the point I was just trying to make earlier was that these companies are trying to sell technologies, but it's hard to get farmers to sign up on their platforms. And yeah, we make the point about the business models because a lot of these companies use a lot of different technologies, and it's not really just one technology that makes this company able to achieve impact. It's really how they're using it holistically across their platform and to have a clear business model to leverage that technology to make an impact.
I guess the related question, it's certainly possible in agriculture to increase yields relatively quickly, but not necessarily on a long-term sustainable basis. So I'm wondering whether any of the companies you saw, the case study, it was a question of just adding fertilizer or using more water in a way that might boost the yields quickly, but in the long run just wouldn't be sustainable.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the company that I spoke about, cropping, was very much particular about that because they wanted to ensure that farmers use the resources efficiently. So they have tools that measure, for instance, the moisture content so that they ensure that the amount of water that, or the level of water they irrigate is the right quantity. In terms of nutrition, they test soil nutritional levels and ensure that the right nutrients is used so that you don't have over application of fertilizer and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I think what we observed based on our interviews was that these farmers, before they had engaged with these companies, they were doing exactly what you said, were overusing fertilizers or just not using the optimal amount of resources. And when these companies came in, they really managed that and they were able to really see definitive results. And we were able to verify that to some extent. So we were pretty optimistic about the results that some of these companies had achieved, especially Croppin, which we had discussed.
I think of impact investing as essentially a public-private partnership in most cases, especially agriculture, especially in poor countries. Now, there usually needs to be a cover of first lost equity of some kind from a philanthropic or a public sector. I mean, because it's not just returns, it's risk. My question is, in the impact investing you looked at, what was the percentage cover of first lost equity, or the kind of things that would allow private impact investors to have some chance of actually making a return in a highly variable kind of return environment? I mean, are we talking about 20%, 50%? What sort of cover?
Yeah, we certainly saw that with many of the companies we interviewed. We saw capital structures that had not only impact investing money, but also grant money from organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That's the part where we had limited information because companies weren't willing to share their detailed financial statements with us. But we did notice that was a key aspect. But it wasn't really necessarily true across all the companies. I would say that some companies, had one impact investor, and I would say that impact investor was kind of serving both functions as a philanthropic role, but also with the prospects for profitability. And I think some of the questions that you guys asked really highlights that this is a really nascent industry. We're talking about most of these companies have not been around for more than 5 years, and that's consistent across the industry in food technology in India. So I think the verdict is still out, really, whether this can be a profitable industry. So it'll be interesting to see where things go in the next few years. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for so patiently to finish through this, but these guys will wow you, and they are all right. So, get ready. There's a yummy reception.
Thank you all for coming and staying through 6 amazing presentations. As you can tell, I think that they just up the level of work every single year, and I am completely floored at the amount of work that you did for all of your clients. I know that they've expressed their gratitude to you, to each of your teams, but also to me separately. So thank you all for making us look good, making you look good, but also making your professors look good, and for answering all those questions so well. And now the practicum presentations are done, and we can go and have a drink and eat something, and I hope all of you will join us. So thank you.